Hi everyone, I'm Sam, and today we're going to talk about negotiation. In October 1962, President John F. Kennedy sat in the Oval Office of the White House, examining a set of grainy black and white reconnaissance photos. The images revealed that the Soviet Union was secretly installing medium-range nuclear missiles in Cuba. This wasn't just a routine military maneuver. Once fully deployed, those missiles could strike Washington in just a matter of minutes. The crisis brought the world to the brink of nuclear war and became a pivotal moment in the history of negotiation. Over the next tense days, the dialogue between the US and the Soviet Union was far from a simple game of give and take. It became a psychological battle full of calculation, misjudgment, and risk management. At the heart of it was a mindset known in negotiation theory as a zero-sum game. If one side gains, the other must lose. The only strategy under this thinking is to pressure the other side into backing down, or even failing entirely. While this might work in short-term conflicts, in high-stakes situations like this, it risks mutual destruction. During the Cold War, zero-sum thinking was the dominant logic behind international relations. Negotiation was seen as an extension of strategy, a matter of dividing resources and making compromises, but always backed by a raw contest of power. Yet the Cuban Missile Crisis forced a shift in perspective. If both sides clung to zero-sum logic, the only possible outcome would be total devastation. In the final hours, secret communications and back-channel coordination between President Kennedy and Soviet Premier Khrushchev opened the door to a different possibility. A non-zero-sum approach, one where the goal wasn't to win or lose, but to avoid losing together. Khrushchev ultimately agreed to withdraw the missiles from Cuba, while the US privately promised to remove its missiles from Turkey. It was a deal that looked like mutual concession, but in reality, both sides got what they needed. It also marked a subtle but important turning point in Cold War diplomacy, a first step away from the zero-sum logic that had long ruled the game. Before the Cuban Missile Crisis, negotiations in international politics were often seen as an extension of the zero-sum game. This term comes from game theory and means that the total amount of resources is fixed. If you gain something, I must lose the same amount. In other words, there's no room for a win-win outcome. Negotiation was like fighting over a cake, not about slicing it skillfully, but about grabbing faster and harder. This mindset was deeply embedded in the logic of Cold War politics. The United States and the Soviet Union were classic opponents in this zero-sum framework. Whether it was over Berlin, the Korean War, or the space race, the competition wasn't just about territory or technology. It was about gaining the upper hand, an intangible form of dominance. Negotiation was seen as a tactical pause to regroup or rearm, not a genuine process of cooperation. Trust was nearly non-existent. The negotiation table was a place for probing and calculation, not understanding. But the final phase of the Cuban Missile Crisis hinted at a new possibility. When both sides realized that continuing the zero-sum game would lead to total destruction, the logic of negotiation had to shift. This wasn't a sudden burst of goodwill. It was a hard reality that forced two rivals to ask themselves, is there a non-zero-sum way to avoid the worst? Non-zero-sum negotiation isn't about idealistic harmony. It's a pragmatic strategy of coexistence. It's based on the idea that, in certain situations, if both sides are willing to reveal their true needs, it might be possible to find an option both can live with. Not necessarily a win-win, but at least not a lose-lose. Starting with the Cuban crisis, the Cold War rivals gradually put this thinking into practice, setting up the famous hotline between Washington and Moscow, and signing arms control agreements. These steps reflected a subtle shift toward non-zero-sum thinking. Competition remained, but the possibility of cooperation was back on the table. This shift from it's either you or me to we can't both die was more than just a strategic adjustment. It marked a fundamental change in how negotiation was understood. It reminds us that negotiation isn't only about winning or losing. Sometimes the greatest success is simply surviving together. Around the same time, in the early 1960s, a drug called thalidomide shocked the world. Originally developed by a German pharmaceutical company to treat morning sickness in pregnant women, it ended up causing severe birth defects in more than 10,000 newborns. What made the tragedy even worse was that when early signs of side effects began to surface, the company, and in some cases, regulatory bodies, chose to downplay or even cover up the information until the damage became irreversible. When affected families demanded compensation and reform, both sides entered a long and difficult negotiation. This wasn't simply about money, it was about the complete collapse of public trust. In Germany at the time, people didn't just lose faith in one company, they began to question whether the entire medical and regulatory system could still protect them. Eventually, a government-brokered settlement created a collective compensation fund. But the cost was heavy. The pharmaceutical company was forced to issue a public apology and take on decades of financial responsibility. At the same time, the German government had to overhaul its drug regulatory framework. This wasn't a simple deal. It was a long process of rebuilding trust. As one victim representative later put it, what we wanted wasn't just money. It was acknowledgement, respect, and a guarantee that this would never happen again. In the corporate world, broken trust is often the spark that causes negotiations to fall apart. Take the Volkswagen emissions scandal, for example. When it was revealed that the company had been manipulating vehicle emissions data in the US for years, both the government and consumer groups lost all trust in the company. No amount of technical concessions at the negotiation table could repair that damage. In the end, Volkswagen faced billions in fines and spent years trying to rebuild its brand and regain negotiating credibility. All of these events highlight a critical truth. Trust is not an optional bonus in negotiation. It's the foundation that determines whether talks can even begin and whether they can continue. Trust doesn't have to come from a long-standing relationship. It can also be intentionally built during negotiation. Through transparent information, verifiable systems, genuine intent, and ongoing dialogue, trust can be cultivated piece by piece. Because while contract terms can be printed on paper, only trust makes people willing to sign them. By the early 1970s, the United Kingdom was preparing to hand over control of its colony, Rhodesia, to a local government. On paper, it was a decolonization process, peaceful, orderly, and representative. But in reality, only a handful of white elites and senior diplomats sent from London were seated at the negotiation table. The voices of the vast African population were almost entirely absent. This historical episode reveals a fundamental truth about the world of negotiation. Not everyone has an equal voice. Sometimes it's not about how well you negotiate, it's about whether you're even invited into the room. This is the problem of structural inequality in negotiation. Asymmetries in information, resources, language, and institutional bias often shape the outcome long before talks officially begin. For example, in land development negotiations between multinational corporations and indigenous communities in developing countries, corporations typically arrive with legal teams, economic models, and international political influence, while local communities may not even speak the language of the negotiation, relying on volunteers or activists as intermediaries. Even in the workplaces we're familiar with, these power imbalances are everywhere. When major tech companies negotiate salaries or working hours with junior engineers, management has access to market data, alternative labor, and time on their side. Without collective organization or backup options, workers often end up being informed rather than genuinely consulted. But inequality in power doesn't mean the situation is hopeless. The key is to first acknowledge that it exists, and then deliberately design ways to balance it. That might include giving both sides access to equivalent advisory support, appointing neutral mediators, guaranteeing time for the weaker party to speak, or even structuring the agenda so that marginal voices are heard first. Real negotiation isn't just about exchanging terms, it's about challenging structures. Because the power to decide who gets to negotiate, how the negotiation unfolds, and what is on the table often determines the outcome before any deal is made. And that kind of power can shape everything. In 1981, a quiet revolution in negotiation thinking began with the publication of a book called Getting to Yes. Co-authored by Roger Fisher and William Ury of the Harvard Negotiation Project, The book was short in length, but powerful in impact, introducing a disruptive idea. Negotiation isn't a battle where one side must win and the other must lose. For a long time, negotiations were widely viewed as zero-sum games. Any gain for one side was seen as a loss for the other. This mindset was deeply rooted in business, diplomacy, and even personal conflict. But Fisher and Urey argued that effective negotiation should go beyond surface-level positions and focus instead on the underlying interests. In other words, rather than arguing over what each party wants, ask why they want it. When both sides are willing to step back and explore each other's motivations and needs, it becomes possible to craft solutions that are acceptable and even beneficial to both. This shift in thinking has since shaped real-world practice. Take the negotiations for the North American Free Trade Agreement, for instance. The US, Canada, and Mexico didn't simply haggle over numbers. They worked through institutional frameworks to pursue long-term economic balance and stable cooperation. It reflected a new kind of negotiation logic. Cooperation isn't weakness or compromise, it's a pragmatic and sustainable strategic choice. The win-win principle proposed in Getting to Yes continues to influence negotiations in business, diplomacy, social movements, and beyond. The book reminds us that negotiation isn't just a contest over limited resources. It's also a creative process for expanding what's possible. And that process begins with understanding, respect, and a shared willingness to solve problems together. In negotiations, what really gives you confidence at the table isn't how loud your voice is or how tough your stance seems, it's what backup options you have. This is the core of a key idea in Harvard's negotiation theory, your best alternative to a negotiated agreement, or BATNA. Put simply, BATNA means, if this deal falls through, what else can you do? Your greatest power in a negotiation often comes from the option you have outside of it. If you know you have a solid fallback, you don't need to accept a bad deal just to reach an agreement. But if you have nothing to fall back on, if you're entirely dependent on the deal, it's easy to end up cornered, saying yes to terms you don't actually want. One of the most well-known examples comes from the peace talks between Palestine and Israel. After the Oslo Accords in the 1990s, both sides entered what seemed like a golden era of historic negotiations. But the Palestinian side had a very weak BATNA. They lacked solid international support and didn't have the leverage to walk away from the table with any meaningful alternative. Israel, on the other hand, had far more options: military, economic, and diplomatic. So while the negotiations may have looked equal on the surface, in reality, the Palestinians were in a position where they had little choice but to accept unfavorable terms. Without a viable way to say no, their hand was always weaker. In the business world, BATNA is a vital strategic asset. For example, in major cross-border mergers or acquisitions, a company that negotiates with multiple potential buyers or sellers at once stays flexible and strong. When the other side knows you have alternatives, they're more likely to make concessions. But if you're tied to one single deal, your leverage disappears. Having a strong BATNA means you're not begging for a deal. You're open to cooperation, but not afraid to walk away. It helps you evaluate an agreement with a clear head, rather than making hasty concessions due to stress, deadlines, or external pressure. That's why the best negotiators ask themselves before the talks even begin, if I don't sign this deal, then what? The better prepared you are, the harder it is for others to pressure you. And that calm, quiet strength is often exactly what brings the other side to the table, ready to talk seriously. In July 2000, U.S. President Bill Clinton brought together Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat and Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak for an intense 14-day peace summit at Camp David, the presidential retreat in Maryland. Hopes were high. At one point, the two sides came close to reaching an agreement, but as the talks reached their final stage, the atmosphere quickly soured, and the negotiations ultimately collapsed. The breakdown wasn't just about political positions or the content of the agreement. It was also driven by the emotional dynamics at the table. Arafat began to feel disrespected by how the talks were being managed, leading to growing distrust and emotional withdrawal. Barak, on the other hand, felt he had made major concessions, only to be met with little acknowledgement, which in turn made him appear cold and impatient. At a critical meeting, the two sides even clashed openly, plunging the talks into a stalemate. In hindsight, many analysts believe that emotional mismanagement was one of the key reasons for the failure, despite the fact that the proposed terms were already close to what both sides might have accepted. The emotional tension ultimately unraveled everything. Emotions aren't limited to high-level international negotiations. They also shape everyday crisis negotiations. Take, for example, the 2010 mining disaster in Chile, when 33 miners were trapped underground for 69 days. Above ground, tensions were mounting among families, the media, and the government. Negotiations and coordination became strained and chaotic. Yet government officials remained composed in the face of public pressure, choosing to respond with calm communication and steady reassurance. Their patient approach helped ease tensions and eventually led to a globally celebrated rescue operation. These cases remind us that emotions are not the enemy of negotiation. They are one of its core forces. When expressed thoughtfully, emotions can signal firm positions, build trust, release pressure, and foster mutual understanding. Great negotiators don't ignore emotions, they manage them. They read the room, understand emotional cues, and respond with situational intelligence at critical moments. Because in any negotiation, emotions aren't just part of the background. They're often one of the driving forces that can make or break an agreement. In fact, emotions and framing are often deeply intertwined. A person's emotional reaction is often shaped by the way something is presented. In negotiation, it's not just the facts that matter, but also the tone, wording, and narrative. These subtle differences can trigger vastly different responses and decisions. That brings us to a critical concept in negotiation: framing. Would you support an energy policy titled, "Nuclear power can reduce carbon emissions by 80%? Now, what if the headline was, "Nuclear accidents are catastrophic and irreversible"? The facts haven't changed, but the framing has, and that can completely change how people respond. This isn't wordplay. It's one of the most important yet often overlooked elements in negotiation. In behavioral economics, this is known as prospect theory, developed by Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky. They discovered that people are more sensitive to loss than to gain. In other words, saying you might lose this opportunity is more likely to drive action than saying you could gain this opportunity. This insight has shaped many public negotiations. Take nuclear energy, for example. When countries promote nuclear power, they often try to shift the frame away from risk of nuclear disaster and toward energy independence and climate goals. In Finland, for instance, the government and nuclear advocates framed nuclear energy as a necessary response to climate change, rather than a resurgence of outdated technology. The result? A significant rise in public support for the same policy. The same goes for welfare reform. A healthcare proposal described as guaranteed coverage for all tends to receive much broader support than if it's framed as government control over your healthcare decisions, even if the underlying policy is nearly identical. This isn't about people being irrational. It's about how human psychology responds to loss, risk, and control. In negotiation, controlling the frame means controlling the narrative. Do you describe an agreement as a concession or as mutual benefit? Is it a sacrifice of short-term gains or an investment in long-term stability? These small wording choices can have a big impact. That's why great negotiators don't just negotiate terms, they shape the story. Because sometimes how you say something matters more than what you're saying. On the night of December 12, 2015, the lights in the Paris Climate Summit negotiation room burned late into the night. Representatives from nearly 200 countries gathered to debate the final wording of an agreement that would shape the planet's future. That night, it wasn't just a test of conviction. It was a race against time. The draft of the Paris Climate Agreement had already gone through dozens of revisions in the week leading up to the final day. Yet key disagreements remained, especially over phrases related to responsibility and financial commitments. But the host country, France, had set a firm deadline for that evening. Any delay could mean the collapse of the agreement, a cooling of political momentum, growing resistance back home. or a loss of political capital once delegates returned to their own countries. And so, in those final hours, negotiations entered a phase of what might be called irrational acceleration. Some delegates agreed to terms they weren't fully satisfied with, just to secure an agreement they could refine later. Even legal language, like the choice between shall and should, was deliberately softened at the last moment to make the deal more broadly acceptable. This wasn't just a technical adjustment, it was a psychological effect of time pressure. As the deadline neared, participants were more willing to compromise in order to avoid letting all their previous efforts go to waste. Behavioral economists call this the sunk cost effect. The more time, energy, and resources you've invested, the harder it becomes to walk away, even when you probably should. Similar dynamics often play out in major corporate mergers. Take Microsoft's acquisition of LinkedIn in 2016, or Disney's acquisition of 21st Century Fox between 2017 and 2018. These massive deals often hinge on timing, getting everything signed before a fiscal year ends or before a regulatory window closes. In the final countdown, legal and financial teams work through the night, not because there's no other time, but because missing this window means missing the deal. These cases remind us, time isn't just a clock ticking beside the negotiation table, it's a player sitting at the table. Time can be a source of pressure, but it can also be a source of momentum. A firm deadline can help push both sides toward compromise and decision-making. But if time is manipulated or mismanaged, it can lead people to accept unfavorable terms they wouldn't otherwise agree to. The best negotiators don't try to escape time, they design it. They shape the tempo of talks so that time becomes a tool that works for them, not against them. We've traveled from the zero-sum confrontations of the Cold War to the possibility of win-win outcomes, from Palestine's disadvantaged position to the importance of having a strong alternative, from the emotional unraveling at Camp David to the realization that even the most reasonable terms can fail without trust and emotional intelligence. What we've learned is this: the best negotiators aren't masters of manipulation or clever phrasing. They are sharp observers, emotionally steady, and capable of understanding the other side's position and struggles. They know how to turn emotion into a resource, time into rhythm, and culture into a bridge. They don't measure success by whether they win, they measure it by whether the conversation can continue. But more than anything, negotiation is a mirror. It reflects the distribution of power in society, the design of our institutions, and the structures of fairness and inequality. Who gets to speak and who doesn't? Who has options and who is trapped? These questions are often silently answered long before any negotiation begins. We learn to negotiate not just to land better contracts, but to better understand how the world is shaped, layer by layer, through dialogue, conflict, and compromise. So after hearing this story, don't just ask yourself, did I learn how to negotiate? Ask instead, do I now better understand how the world comes together, falls apart, or fails to even begin the conversation? Because learning to negotiate isn't just about changing the outcome of a single discussion, it's about changing the way you see all human interaction. That's it for today, and I'll see you in the next episode.